The poet Addison Alexander said, "There is a time we know not when, a point we know not where, that marks the destiny of men to glory or despair." The Christian community of the Near East is at that point. And whether it moves forward towards glory or it falls in despair, it's up to each one of you who has stood and are here today. Now is the time, and now is the point where action is demanded, not of some, not of a few, but of many. You may be one, but together you are many, and you are strong, and you are the voice of strength. And the strategy for the future, the movement, and that's part of the problem. This has been concern, but it's not a movement. But the important part of the movement is that we begin to coalesce and we begin to rise. Flannery O'Connor said, "Everything that rises must converge." So we are at that time and the point of convergence. And so much of it depends on you. So much of it depends on you. You should be humbled to be in the presence of those representatives who testified and the things they have witnessed themselves and they have suffered. And then you must decide enough is enough, as that young man said who was assassinated in church. You know, when Western governments yield to the overtures of the OIC to protect the values of Islamic society, they tacitly undermine the other in those societies, the minorities. And inevitably, the consolidation of their manifest duty to rule and impose the tenets of Islamic law on all Muslims and non-Muslims spells the demise of those minorities. Just in the last century, 100 years, the population of Christians in the Near East has shrunk from 20% to less than 2%. This past year, the number of Christians who have been physically harmed has doubled what it was in 2009 and 2010. And so what we're faced with is a challenge, and it is an existential challenge. Whether there will be a Near Eastern community that is vibrant and contributes to the society in which they live and are protected and have this certain expectation of justice and freedom to allow them to contribute to the well-being of that society. There are others here present that, in fact, Dr. Justin Akuse and Luke are two Igbos who have a wonderful report on the state of Christians in Nigeria. Just recently, Boko Haram issued a press release stating that it is a duty and their target to attack Christians. And there are others here who provide wonderful information so you can be informed and educated, such as Jeff Sellers of Compass Direct, is the editor of Compass Direct, a very wonderful publication that reports with integrity. And Peter Betbaso, the Assyrian News Agency, and others. Depend on them to give you direction on how to proceed. The acceptable bounds within which we or they are allowed to exist is neither tolerance nor freedom. The implications of censoring what we say about Islam and what one can do within Islamic society presents the Christian community with the dilemma of being neither able to criticize the principal ideas that threaten their existence, nor to claim the right to define its own identity. And so, therefore, they are destined to remain the other. And that is profoundly xenophobic and racist. Just as in pre-war Germany, latent and collective racist attitudes towards Jews by a tacit German culture contributed to genocide, just as much as the Nazi principles. The violence, the intimidation, and marginalization by the forces of Islamization, and more importantly, the acquiescence of the larger Muslim society to those tactics is the socio-psychological foundation for genocide. And that is what we have to be worried about. That is the defining of the existential challenge by which these communities are facing. It is Edmund Burke who reminds us that the concessions of the weak are the concessions of fear. The acceptance of one's own oppression and inferiority generates weakness, and fear follows. Greater fear puts the non-Muslim community in a position in which they are more vulnerable. And this is a pattern that the Islamists have employed in order to preserve the status quo in their favor in all of these countries. And it is a pattern in which is repeating itself in our own society. And if we're not careful, we too will be giving the same testimony. Only resistance to the tools of marginalization, fear, and oppression can correct the imbalance between the victim and the victimizer. And the failure, and I say it is a failure of the Western Christians to ally themselves with those facing discrimination and persecution in the Near East, has weakened both. We are reminded that the English poet Erasmus Darwin said, "He who allows oppression shares the crime." To the Christian community of the United States, we who allow the oppression share the crime. And I should add, will be doomed to share in its consequences. There is a moral imperative that we organize in solidarity with the plight of the Christians in the Middle East and to strengthen their resistance. And we do that both by organizing on a grassroots effort to be in solidarity, to ally ourselves to those who are suffering, and also to use the influence of each of us as individuals joining together as a political strength and power. And this is a movement in which we are called to action. This is a movement in which we must define the movement and the moment. It's important for us to share the information, but it is more important for us to raise our moral indignation against the violence and intimidation. And unless we have the backbone to do that in our own communities and in Washington and at the doorsteps of those organizations that represent the oppressor, we will have failed these witnesses. The movement is an effort to mobilize our society, to embrace the besieged communities' aspirations for freedom, equality, and security. There needs to be a concerted effort, and you can do it. Every jurisdiction, religious jurisdiction, whether it's a diocese, a synod, or presbytery, or a district, can have at least one person to be the point person to help formulate campaigns and responses. One person. And that is the beginning of a grassroots movement. But there are many competing causes. Defending the faith should be at the top regarding our energy. And without real solidarity, our co-religionists in Muslim countries are sitting ducks. In solidarity, there is strength. And what we need to counter are the Islamist organizations who have undermined the resolve of the Western Christians by saying that well-being of non-Muslim minorities in Islamic societies is not their justice issue, that there is no legitimate role for them to play on their behalf. To criticize and aid those who are suffering under Sharia or opposing jihad is actually to be a party to injustice and racism against Muslims. In other words, to engage Islam in the field of justice is to be a party to injustice, Islamophobia. Remember, so important, The one who controls the language controls the debate. And it's time we begin to reclaim the debate. We must act in such a way that we would counter what the Islamists have done in terms of pressing, whether it's censorship legislation, through defamation legislation, or intimidation or fear. Anything which weakens the bond of power between the victim and those who would assist the victim works to the benefit of the oppressor. And they know. They live in Western society, and they're very sophisticated, and they know that they can play the fears of intolerance of Americans in order to impose intolerance. And that's how they've claimed the debate on justice and freedom and security. But as you can see and you know in your hearts, that's our debate. That's the field that we can play best on, because we know who is the victim and we know who the victimizers are. The Arab Spring captured the imagination of freedom lovers around the world, and yet the revolution is lost because there was not critical mass of political and social support within their countries, nor the critical mass of political support from the West. In the eagerness to dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood, which may be realpolitik by the administration, it has only hastened the demise of the prospects for a meaningful place for the freedom coalitions in the countries that have gone through this Arab revolution. So the first element of this movement's strategy is to recapture the justice and freedom agenda on behalf of the Christians of the Near East. And I believe that is possible. I think there's been a real opening. There has been a real movement. If you look at the recent article of Newsweek in which it featured on the front cover personality article on the Christians who have been forgotten, you realize that there is an opening in a popular culture. And there are opportunities for us to pry that door completely open by airing the suffering and the oppression which these people are facing. In other words, what we need to do as a movement is to begin to name and tame, or if you want to shame, it's okay, but name and tame the protagonists, the Muslim Brotherhood organizations that are here, and begin to attack them at the point which they think that they are strongest, and that is that they are unjust, they hate freedom, and they're oppressive. And if we do that, we begin to pry away the strength which they are counting on. And so it is that the movement is an effort to mobilize the society by putting people together in a big way. Campaigns must mean feet on the ground and voices in the air. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes in Washington it's easy to rally and to demonstrate. But it's just not in Washington that needs to happen. It has to happen all throughout our country. And we also have to target the appropriate target of those demonstrations and protests. Whenever something egregious happens in the world, it's a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of organizations to put together a rally in Washington in front of the White House. But rather, those rallies should be put at the doorstep of the OIC representative to the UN in New York, to the offices of CARE in Washington, and also in Illinois, in the Chicago area, to the Islamic Society of North America. How many demonstrations have been held in Chicago highlighting the ideals of Islam? I don't think there have been any. And so they act with impunity. The OIC and these organizations, if they are targeted for your protest, will begin to focus attention on their behavior and their ideas. And that's what we have to do in order to retake the agenda. There are some other things which are important for you to do. You can do now. In June of last year, Congressman Frank Wolf introduced H.R. 440, which would authorize the President of the United States to appoint a special envoy for religious freedom of Christians in the Near East and Central Asia. And you know what? It passed overwhelmingly. I think maybe there are 20 votes against it. And a companion bill was introduced in the Senate by Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. It was read twice, assigned to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And as of yesterday, it is still in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Get on the phone to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff and say, why isn't this moving? Get on the phone to Senator Durbin. I've known him for 40 years. And I remember in those early days he was an advocate for human rights. Press his feet to the fire. Make sure if you have any other in your sphere of influence, you contact them and move it. And then once it passes the Senate, then it is the next step, which is finding the best person to fill that position and to give it teeth and backbone and pressure. And that means pressure on the White House. Because the bill, the authorization has to be executed in such a way that the United States is seen as saying, these are endangered people of our concern, and it is now our national priority. Otherwise, it will just be another position in the State Department, and you have to figure out which color code and which floor you have to follow in order to find them. Next thing is, it's time. It is time that we have a major demonstration on behalf of the 100 million who are in danger throughout the world of persecution. That needs to be in Washington. And you say, well, it's hard to do it. Get a bus from your churches and from your organizations, and you can do it. You look at Save Darfur. The Masalit community of Darfur is a very small community. I remember leading demonstrations in front of the Sudan embassy. One of the most happy times was setting up and arranging for congressmen to be arrested. It was an act of civil disobedience, and a few celebrities. But sometimes that's what it needs, that's what it takes in order to garner that energy within our popular culture. This is naturally an American issue, but we have to work at it. And so I've got my card. If you're interested in being part of a steering committee to put together a rally in Washington, I want to hear from you, and we're going to work with other organizations, and hopefully maybe the center will be a great sponsor. Because the center has done wonderful things on the cutting edge of creativity. I always quote Saul Alinsky, and I know, but you know, he had some great ideas. That's not for liberals only. Conservatives should use and read his book, because there's a lot of creativity on how to gain control of the debate. And this is what we have to do in the movement today. Because if we don't define it, somebody else will. Next, last action point. Last February, a group of Middle Eastern Christian prelates from the United States, Armenians, Maronites, Copts, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, a large organization called Chemget, wrote a letter to the president asking to sit down with him so that they could talk about the adversity that Christians face in the Middle East. They didn't hear anything. Not by letter, not vocally. I talked to the Maronite Bishop of Brooklyn, Bishop Gregory Mansour, yesterday, in fact. And I said, Bishop Gregory, what have you heard? They said, we issued another letter in February. The same letter. They haven't heard anything. Not by letter, not by voice, not even from a public liaison person. Nothing. The administration sees no political benefit. What they need to understand is that there is a political cost. And pressure on the White House to at least sit down with these bishops to talk about Christians in the Middle East. These are the Archbishop, the Armenian Archbishop of the Archdiocese, the bishops of the Maronite Church, of the Coptic Church, of the Protestant churches. And the president refuses to sit down and meet with them. And yet, who does the president invite into his office? You probably could guess. This is the point that marks the future. I've been an advocate for almost 30 years. And the existential threat today is as great as it has ever been in that time period. And I don't say that as a boast or an exaggeration. It is there. But also I see the opportunities to create solidarity are even greater today than they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I remember there were a handful of people who were trying to raise the issue of what the Islamists were doing. And I remember those early rallies in New York where organizations from the Copts and the Pakistanis and the Indonesians and the Indians came and they said, we came to this country to escape that. And now we're finding that we have to meet it head on here. It is our responsibility to make the effort to make this a movement that leads to glory and not allow it to diminish into despair. Thank you.